I'm Kwame Jeffries, Associate Professor of History in the Department of History at The Ohio State University, where I teach African American history with a specialization on civil rights, black protests, and African American contemporary history. I've been thinking a lot lately about the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. We have just passed the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And often when we think about Dr. King, we immediately are drawn to his 1963 March on Washington speech, in which he gives his famous "I have a dream" remarks. And we have become, in a way, fixated on those words, on that term, "I have a dream," and his vision of a society in which his children are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But we often overlook another important passage in that speech, and when he talks about America owing African Americans a promissory note for fulfilling the obligations of justice, of being able to live in a society that lives up to its own ideals, but then saying too that America has failed to honor that check. In fact, it has been returned marked insufficient funds. And what he is talking about there is important. It's something that we overlook. And that is that the problems that African Americans have faced historically in America have been because they have been people of color. They've been marked by their skin color, by race. Certainly we know that race is a social construction, but it has real meaning in the American context. And King believed that in order to eventually get to a society that does not hold race against people, that we have to consider race in the policies and programs that we use in order to remedy past discrimination, in order to correct and adjust for discrimination that is still occurring today. So two things I've really been thinking about as I've been reflecting on sort of King's life and his legacy, and that is, yes, he wanted a colorblind society, but the way he argued that we had to get there was by taking race into consideration when we are engaging people in all aspects of our life, whether that's in education, whether that's in politics, whether that's in housing or the like. For a long time, moving out of the civil rights era in the 1960s into the 1970s, into the Black Power era, or at least for that period of time, people were very conscious about using race in the realm of education to open the doors of access. Race had been used to exclude African Americans, and so therefore we were going to consider race as part of the equation in terms of admissions, in terms of promotion, and all these other things in the realm of higher education. Called it affirmative action. It was really designed in part to remedy past discrimination, as well as to account for, take into consideration the ongoing obstacles based upon race and barrier that were excluding African Americans and people of color from having equal access to education, especially higher education. Well, that we've moved away from. Having a colorblind society is nice. We're a long way away from that. But the way to get there, the way to achieve that, is not by ignoring race in the present, not by pretending that racial discrimination doesn't continue, not by pretending that we're still not living with a legacy of racial discrimination, but by accepting the fact that both implicit and explicit bias and racial discrimination still exists, we're still living with it, and that we have to come up with policies and programs that don't shy away from race, don't pretend that it doesn't exist, but that call it out specifically so that everybody, regardless and including various racial backgrounds and economic backgrounds, have a seat at the table. When we think about racial discrimination today, we often we narrowly define it to somebody who's using the N-word or somebody who's walking around saluting, offering a Nazi salute or something like that. But of course we know that there are microaggressions, right? In other words, people who will express sort of hostility towards people of color on sort of day-to-day basis. I mean, we see these examples all the time. All you gotta do is look on social media. whether it is in a Starbucks, two young African Americans who are sitting there waiting for a friend, and the manager of the rest of the store, coffee shop, calls them in for loitering, if for no other reason than they are African American, they are people of color, and deemed a threat. And you think, all right, how is that affecting, anybody beyond those individual lives? Well, it gets multiplied out. How often does it happen, not just in a Starbucks, but in a housing rental situation, in an employment situation? So these things are still very much alive with us in practice on an individual basis. And so that has to be remedied, to say nothing of the ways in which racial discrimination is still deeply embedded in the systems that really govern our society. And so if you have not been allowed, literally for several generations, to accumulate wealth, to own property and the like, and then suddenly you throw the doors open and say, okay, now everybody is on an equal plane. Well, the reality is African Americans, people of color, haven't had the opportunity to accumulate the kinds of wealth that would put them on an actual equal footing when it comes to home ownership, when it comes to developing the kind of credit history and to get the loans that you would need to purchase a home. I mean, so we're dealing with sort of the long legacy of racial discrimination and the personal prejudices that people still harbor and hold, both consciously and unconsciously, that lead them, whether it's a manager at a Starbucks or a police officer, to see an African American man or woman, particularly young people, as a potential threat and danger to them when they are doing nothing more than minding their business. So on an individual basis, I mean, the first thing we have to do is accept the fact that we live in a society that is fundamentally racist, and we have to be aware of that. Right? Racism and capitalism are truly the twin pillars of American society, from the founding of this country until the present. And we have to recognize and acknowledge that, whether it is just sort of images of beauty to perceptions of who's a threat in society. We have to realize the ways in which that affects how we interact with people, right? And be conscious of that so that we can then work against it. And we also have to be candid in our conversations and honest, and not pretend that we don't see race, not pretend that we don't see difference. There's nothing wrong with seeing difference. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging difference. There is something wrong with discriminating against people because of that difference, and that's what we don't want. We do want folk to acknowledge, I'm an African American. I want people to see me as an African American. You don't do me any favors by saying I don't see your color. No, my race reflects the culture and community that I come from. That's me, and so to acknowledge that is not a problem, right? I mean, that needs to be celebrated, but don't discriminate against me because of that. That's where it becomes a problem.